Hey everyone, and welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. It's officially warbler season, so this week we decided to talk about the Blackpoll Warbler. If you don't know much about warblers and want to know more, this is a great episode for you. If you already know a lot, this will also be fun because John and Shannon really provide a lot of fascinating info to Amanda and I. Blackpolls have one of the largest and most impressive migrations of any warbler, and for such a tiny bird, it's actually pretty hard to comprehend. We also asked John to give us an overview of warblers in general, as this is our second season that we've really tried to look for them on our own. We learned that John has seen upwards of 20 different warbler species in a single day, which is pretty crazy. This episode is a ton of fun, and I'm really excited for you to be able to hear it. Okay, time to talk Blackpoll Warblers. Go grab your binoculars, and let's get into it. Yeah, should we get into the Blackpoll Warbler then?
Yeah,
Sure.
let's do it.
So John, I'm curious just to hear from your perspective on the Blackpoll Warbler. This is our first Warbler episode that we've done. So I was thinking maybe we talk just a little bit about warblers in general before we get into specifics on the Blackpoll.
Yeah, I mean, there's a family Parulidae, or New World warblers, and it's a large family that includes a whole bunch of North American species that are migratory, and there are upwards of 35 or so species like that. And then you get down into South America, and there's another 26 species or so that are resident throughout South America. So it's a really successful New World group. And Blackpoll Warbler is, well, notable because of how far it migrates. And so it's a bird that breeds across Canada and into the northeastern part of North America in high elevations. But the entire population winters down in the Amazon basin, and they do that by doing some amazing things in terms of their physiology.
Warblers remind me dramatically that names do not indicate relationships, because there are things in the old world that are called warblers, and they're not related to the things that we call warblers here. So just because something's called a warbler or a robin, for example, that doesn't mean they are all part of the same group. So taxonomies, common names do not reflect phylogenies or trees of life. And that's a really important thing. Different cultures have called things that maybe do the same thing, like warblers. They might call them the same thing or similar things, but that doesn't mean they're actually each other's closest relatives are all mixed up together. And so there are warblers in the old world, but they're not the same as our warblers in the new world.
Oh, wow.
So that's my, they're also, our warblers have unbelievable plumages. So if we're talking about worldwide, our warblers have won the plumage jackpot.
Definitely colorful. And here in Chicago, when migration, we get into the late May, is, you can see upwards of 20, 25 species of warblers in a place like Grant Park. And, I like to say that there's probably not a tree in the city of Chicago that a Nashville warbler doesn't land in at some point during migration. And so it's really just a spectacular time when these birds come through. And blackpolls are one of the latest migrants. And that part of that has to do with their where they're coming from. It takes them a long time to get back north. But they'll be here by the end of May. And they can be pretty common, except for the fact that I can't hear them a lot of times.
No, I just played you.
It's
I
true.
just played you a warbler song. So John has high frequency hearing loss, and it's made me sad for quite a while that there are things, with my one good ear that I can hear that he can't. And so I forced him, I threatened him and forced him to go and get his hearing checked, because there are things that can help you if you have that kind of hearing loss. And so he has hearing aids now, and now he can hear things. He can hear chickadees. He could hear the Blackpoll Warbler song that I played. It's probably been several years.
Which is
exciting,
one of
Joe.
the highest
Yeah.
frequency songs of any North American bird.
Yeah, it's most birds sing between 1,000 and 8,000 hertz, and the Blackpoll Warblers is at 10,000. So it's significantly above what you think of as the highest birds. And yeah, so yeah, hearing loss, people, because it's a slow and gradual thing, I don't think you really are aware of what you're missing as it happens gradually to you, as you have trouble hearing small kids or women's voices because they're higher pitched. And people feel a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of shame associated with hearing loss. They don't want to have hearing aids. They certainly don't want to have visible hearing aids. And they're unaware of the advances, the technological advances that have happened in the last several years with respect to hearing aids. So they're unobtrusive, they're high tech. My hearing aids have artificial intelligence in them to help me tolerate sound environments that are really hard for me. So, just go get your hearing checked. A loss of hearing is a leading cause of depression, suicide, falls, all the things that can happen to elderly people. Hearing loss exasperates all of those things. Dementia. Hearing is multidimensional, and it works in your brain in ways that other senses don't. So keep your brain healthy. Go get your hearing checked. Don't be afraid to get hearing aids.
And warblers are a really good group to test it on, because they have all these ranges of vocalizations, from kind of rich whistles to these very high-pitched calls. So I'm looking forward to spring, because I may be able to hear some of them this year.
Oh, awesome.
Have you been able to wear your hearing aids out birding yet, or are they too new?
Yeah, and they definitely make a difference. So yeah, I heard a few brown creepers this spring, which I'm sure I was missing before.
When he first got them, I used to come in behind him in his office and play sounds. And that's how I knew they were working, because he'd just wheel around and all of a sudden you could hear something, the day before he wouldn't have been able to hear, but now he can. So I know it's not just psychosomatic. I know for real he hears things that he didn't hear before.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So we've tried to look, last year looked at warblers and went out with like our group and saw them, and it's obviously really challenging. We tried to do it on our own, and I don't know, it's so fast the way they come in and go, and to identify them, it really helped like going with a group and people who knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I was kind of curious.
They're intensely frustrating if you don't know bird calls. So apps like Merlin can help you, but you have to be ready at that time of year if you want to find. You can't be practicing where to put your binoculars in a tree. You have to know. This is why get yourself some practice before the migration really comes into place, about looking in a tree where you hear something and getting your binoculars up there fast, because they're not going to hang out while you try to figure out what branch in the tree they might be in. So it's a really big challenge. I have a horrible time remembering bird sounds, just absolutely wretched. So
I feel like, that the great thing about spring is one, they are singing, and the other thing is they're in bright plumage. So in the fall, they've molted into these duller plumages in most cases, and so they can get to be harder to tell apart. But in the spring, and a lot of the thing in the spring is they can be up high, and as the leaves come out, they get harder to see and things. But in Chicago, there are days where early spring, you got the warblers coming through, and if it's a little cooler and there are no insects up high, the birds can be down low. And then in those situations, you can have, the opportunity, like a place like Montrose is just amazing with respect to the ability to see some of these warblers at eye level that might be in much higher parts of the canopy in places like the forest preserves.
What's the most warblers you've seen in a day on migration in Chicago?
I think about 23 or so, but I'm sure people like Doug Stotts have had his best day might be 29 or so.
That's a lot of species
It
of
is.
one
It's
family
really
of birds at one time, right?
Oh my gosh.
That's crazy. Yeah.
And they
it definitely
all-
pads your list.
All the different colors and patterns that are on warblers are really, there's a reason the ones that come in the fall are called basic. They have basic plumage because it's dull and boring, greens and olives and brownish and stuff like that. But that's not what they're going to look like at this time of year. And they have fresh feathers when they come through. So they're incredibly vivid reds and oranges, yellows, streaks, blacks and whites, grays, blues. Warblers are really amazing.
You know, and Blackpolls are just these, the males they have this very dark cap, kind of like a chickadee, and a white face and then a black throat, but then their body has got kind of a black with shades of green streaks almost, and so they're a really elegant bird. And I just like the fact that they're going all the way up to northern Canada to breed that every year and then coming back through.
So that's 8,000 kilometers they're going from Brazil to Alaska. A little tiny bird that weighs less than an ounce.
Well,
You know,
no, so about 12
Well, not all
ounces
of
when
them.
they're right. Well, so 12 ounces when they're just moving around and being normal, and then they'll actually double that up to about 20 ounces.
no, they don't weigh 20 ounces.
Are you guys talking about grams?
You're talking about
20
grams,
So
John.
that's
Grams.
grams.
Yeah.
Sorry, grams. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Good job.
That is a
Okay.
monster.
20 grams. Yeah. 12 grams to about over 20 grams. They'll almost double their weight in fat in order to a lot of the population is making this nonstop flight from parts of the northeast coast all the way down to the coast of Brazil to spend the winter, which is just phenomenal. It's
Yeah.
a 4 or 5 day flight.
That's crazy.
And it's just nonstop. They're just in the air that whole time for 4 days.
Yep.
Are they
Unless
flat?
weather
do they?
drives them to the ground.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are they able to like coast at all and ride like, I don't know, currents or anything? Or is it literally
So they're
just a
definitely
constant...
riding currents, and they pick
Okay.
up 2 different sets of currents along the way, which facilitate this. And it's almost certainly, from an evolutionary standpoint, if those currents didn't exist, that would probably mean this wouldn't have ever evolved.
Okay.
But because of those currents, they can make it. And then in the spring, they do it a little bit differently in the sense that they'll come through the West Indies, or jump over to Cuba and South Florida, and then come up into North America.
So when there's like chicks that are born, they're doing that their first year, making that like massive migration just as a...
Better that than being in
even-
the snow in the
Jeez.
coniferous forests of northern Canada, right?
Yeah.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
actually less known about Blackpoll warblers than about many other warblers because a lot of their breeding distribution is outside of the reach of the breeding bird surveys, the things that we use to learn a lot more about the breeding biology of birds. So really, this might be one of the only birds where they know a lot more about them on the wintering grounds and on migration routes than they do about them in their breeding grounds.
I mean, they actually kind of disappear into the Amazon basin in the winter too. So it's amazing.
So it's just
how...
on their migration that we know so much about them. So think about that tiny bird going 8,000 kilometers in a few days. It's incredible.
And then when they track them, I saw like we were just trying to do some research, and they were talking about tracking the Blackpoll warblers, and that they'll put little tracking devices on them to track their migration. I mean, that was crazy to me that there's this tiny little chip that they put on its back and that it'll stay there. And I mean, what an amazing like advancement in technology to be able to see like literally where they're going from. I mean, is that
It
the only
is,
way that they
and-
would really know?
Yeah. So what it really did was it verified things they thought they knew. And
Okay.
and that's really neat. But one of the challenges with that technology is we were talking about bald eagles, and bald eagles are big enough that you can put these trackers on that can actually literally have solar rechargers. They can be big enough to do that. As you get smaller, it gets much harder, and Blackpolls are below the cutoff for a lot of the really good tracking devices that you'd like to potentially use. For instance, it can do it real time. And so I think what they've done with Blackpolls is they've used geolocators sometimes, which are these things that'll actually ping satellites periodically. And so you get more approximate data, but the actual tracking device itself can be small enough that the bird can actually successfully fly with it. So that's always the big trade-off that people are trying to figure out. And my guess is at some point the technology is going to get better, that you'll be able to do real-time tracking. I mean, they've done some of this actually with Kirtland's warblers, where they can put on trackers that'll ping cell phone towers, and you can get much more detailed data. But like Shannon was saying, I think with Blackpolls, because of the fact that they go up into remote parts of central Canada and northern Alaska, it's really hard to get much data on the breeding season, much less get access to birds that you can put trackers on.
So I looked, and we have 1,923 of them in our collections, because they do hit windows not infrequently, unfortunately for them. And when I went to look them up, I was reminded of how much taxonomic change, how many name changes there have been in warblers over the last 10 to 15 years. Because in our database online, with our ancient taxonomy, they were under Dendroica, which used to have almost all of the species of warblers were nestled in Dendroica. But it turns out that Dendroica was not a natural group. They weren't all each other's closest relatives. And it was DNA-based work that showed this. And so there had to be some taxonomic changes. So now Blackpoll Warbler, instead of being in Dendroica, is in Setophaga, which used to be a monotypic genus with just American redstart in it, and now is the largest parulid genus with 34 species, because to try to make them all each other's closest relatives, Setophaga had the priority name associated with it. So they all went in something that used to be monotypic even 15 years ago. That was monotypic. Which means it's the only species in the genus. So there's a lot of changes to bird taxonomy, and that's because we have so much to learn about relationships. And when you know something about relationships like that, you're going to understand bird migration in really different ways to try to figure out the evolution of these migratory systems. You need to nestle that in an understanding of the historical relationships among the species. You need to know what direction things happened in. You can only know what direction things happened in if you nestle them in a tree of life and look at what relatives are doing. So there's been a lot of work that's been done on warblers. And
at the same time, people are bothered by some of the results of the relationship of Blackpoll to its relatives. No, I think it's interesting.
It's true.
So one of the other species that it's often been put next to, I actually don't think there is. I actually think they probably got it right. But Blackpoll is interesting in that there's another species called bay-breasted warbler, which is very similar in size, has a lot of behavioral similarities. They look like each other in the fall to the point that they can be hard to tell apart, except that Blackpoll warblers have these bright orange foot pads that you can often see, which is kind of a minor thing, but true. Anyways, it turns out that when they've looked at this genetically, that Blackpoll and bay-breasted are actually not each other's closest relatives. And Blackpoll is more closely related to, in the DNA phylogenies right now, yellow warbler and chestnut-sided warbler, whereas bay-breasted, I can't remember what else that's with, but Cape May maybe, and
I don't remember.
But those become interesting things with respect to where these birds evolved in terms of the evolution of migration. So Blackpoll breeds much farther north than, say, chestnut-sided, and that may explain one of the ways in which they might have differentiated if they are each other's closest relatives. So there's lots of neat evolutionary questions that you can start asking when you have these relationships like that.
And that tree, the songbird tree of life, shows us another interesting thing about warblers, which was a little bit uncertain, is where did they come from? Where in an evolutionary sense did they originate? And it looks like they are a North American group. So they didn't evolve in the south and then move north. Their closest living relatives look like they're blackbirds, icterids. So that's an interesting thing that the tree can tell you too. It's this mega diverse group of small birds. Where did they come from? So not all diversity comes out of the tropics. There can be other radiations that happen.
That'll be interesting to see how we feel about that over time.
Do you think they're going to be tropical in origin over time? I don't think
Could be
so.
Central American. Yeah, I'm still.
Oh, okay. See, there's uncertainty.
Yeah.
As you get further north, do certain warblers, like, they stop going that far north? Like, so there's a certain point where you're only seeing Blackpoll warblers because they're have the furthest migration, and then maybe a little bit lower than that, there's like another species. And then we're lucky enough that we're on the migration path, so we get to see everything. And then is it the same way down in South America, or do they all go to the same place in South America? Or do we know?
So, now you're asking a really great question. And we had a graduate student that did a really interesting project on his dissertation, part of his dissertation, where he kind of looked at that latitudinal pattern and in the wintering grounds and the breeding grounds, and develop an algorithm to kind of figure out what that was telling you. And he came up with the idea that warblers were, that analysis supported that warblers were, as Shannon was saying, North American in origin. But what you were asking about is absolutely true. So a species like chestnut-sided warbler breeds in hardwood forest across eastern North America, and then Blackpoll is up in coniferous forest further north than that, and at higher elevations in areas where it gets further south. And there's a lot of variation across the warblers like that. So prothonotary warbler is a species that gets up into, there are probably a few pairs in southern Wisconsin, but that's a very common bird in the bottomland hardwood flooded forests in Louisiana and up into southern Illinois. And so in the breeding season, that's an interesting thing about these warblers. In migration, so even though there aren't very many prothonotary warblers north of here, there are a few pairs breeding at Skokie lagoons. But you can see them in migration in Grant Park or Montrose or someplace like that, because they're moving around in the landscape. And some of the southern ones, individuals will overshoot a little bit and show up in the Chicago area. So there are species like Kentucky warbler, which can be seen in Chicago during migration, but there aren't very many breeding Chicago or Kentucky warblers in this part of Illinois.
Okay.
Some really classic ecological work was done looking at the way warblers divide up trees. For example, the notions of intra and interspecific competition, niche partitioning, resource partitioning, things like that, all came from studying how warblers divide up the world. And it's important because there are so many of them that they really can, they're fine scale things you can do when there are so many species. Because they're all related, that's an advantage in some of these things, because they share a lot of their history. So you can look at their evolutionary history. So their differences you can look at in a different way than you would from taxa that come from different parts of the tree that might be in the same place. So there's lots of really important classic works that have been done with using warblers. So they're not all the way throughout a tree, for example. Not every warbler is found in all of the strata of a tree. There's just lots of really cool things with warblers.
In this thing, you mean a real tree as opposed to
a real
tree.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I like actual trees of life, maybe more than normal trees, but.
I had a question, like putting aside the the tree of life talking like the old world naming and the new world naming. What does the term warbler mean or signify? What is the unifying when we think of the term warbler, what is that? Like, I know with creepers that was like a type of movement, or another bird. I can't think of an example right now, but what is a warbler?
So I think the derivation of the term is along the lines of the songs. So they warbling at least is a, maybe I don't know for sure which came first, the warbler or the warbling, but that's what I think of. And what they morphologically what they are is they're long. They have a thin bill that's designed for catching small insects, and then kind of a small, delicate body. And so they're catching smaller insects than a group like kingbirds and larger flycatchers would take. And they're doing it in different ways, like Shannon was saying, is some of them are picking things off the leaves. Some of them are actually finding caterpillars on the undersides of leaves. And so they've definitely been shown to divide up the community by foraging in slightly different ways to one another.
I just looked it up. So Merriam-Webster says that a warbler is one that warbles, a singer or a songster. And then they say something that is annoying. Then they say any of a numerous small, chiefly old world Aussine birds, family Sylviidae, many of which are noted songsters. And then they also say any of numerous small, brightly colored American Aussine species. But they don't talk about, they're not chiefly old. I don't know. I don't like the wording. It's not phylogenetically accurate enough or biogeographically accurate enough.
Sounds like an old world perspective.
Exactly.
But again, Amanda, like, I wouldn't say that a Blackpoll Warbler warbles.
Okay. I wondered about that. Okay. All right. I didn't even know I thought warble was like had to do with sound, but RJ and I were talking today. Is that a verb? Like, could we warble? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it is a verb.
Okay.
To warble.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we should go out this spring and find one of my favorite birds with respect to this, which is warbling vireo.
Oh.
Because I think that bird is incredibly well named for what it does.
Oh. I'm intrigued.
Me too. I want to see that.
So what was your first encounter with warblers, you guys? Do you remember?
Yeah, so we went out with our Audubon group last year and were introduced to the mob tape.
Oh.
So, which we weren't really sure what to expect, but our guide had a speaker that he put out and played it, and it was all these warblers flew in, and we were not in a position to start identifying things, so we were just letting everyone else tell us, like, oh, that's this, and so I think this year we're going to try to be better about like actually learning what to look for and everything. And then I think so do they come back in the fall too on their migration, and that's when their plumage, they don't look as that's when we really struggled because everything looked the same to us.
Yeah.
So we were like kind of like, all right, we're going to figure it out, and then it was like so much harder.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to start using behavioral cues, not sounds too, but behavioral cues. They'll move differently. They'll flip their wings differently. They'll fly slightly differently.
Oh, cool.
But they are a big, big challenge. Just because normally today he saw a purple finch while he was out, and we have this camera attached to our bird feeder, and we get a lot of house finches, and I've gotten used to just seeing the red, deleting the videos as house finches. And it just dawned on me that I better start paying attention because the artificial intelligence, I don't know how good the artificial intelligence in the software for this camera is to distinguish between
But there is this, one of the great things about what we're talking about is you get a group like this, which has a whole bunch of species in it. And as you get to know it, you get to know behaviors. So for instance, if I'm sitting in our backyard and a black and white warbler flies in the spring, I'm going to know it's a black and white warbler before I look at it a lot of times, because black and white warbler has this habit of it behaves much like a nuthatch does, where it spends a lot of times on big parts of trees and moving up and down, so it moves differently than a nuthatch. But at the same time, once it lands on a big trunk like that, it's pretty much got to be a black and white warbler. There aren't other species that are doing that on a regular basis in the same way. And other species are like that, where you get out in the wet areas in the Chicago region in the summer, and if a warbler pops up, it's almost always going to be a common yellowthroat. And so there are just lots of different behavioral things that these different species of warblers do. So with Blackpoll warbler, and this is consistent with their migration route. They're a long-winged warbler, so that they're often up high, and they're fairly slow-moving compared to some of the other species. And so there are little ways in which, once you've seen 20 or 30 compared to some of the other species, you start in your mind, the term that I've always been told to use for this is gestalt, which is just that you've got some cues that you're using in your mind to figure out what they are as you see them.
That's cool. I didn't think to even look for that. So now I'm super interested to look for the different ways that they move and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say that I was thinking about the instance you were talking about, RJ, where we went out with our group and we saw all the warblers, and I can't remember what time of the year it was, whether it was spring or fall, but I do remember the mob tape the speaker was put in a big bush, and I was so frustrated because there were so many leaves and we could see very little, and it reminded me of how appreciative I am right now that there's not any leaves on the trees, and I kind of wish it would stay like that all year.
No, because that would mean it's cold. No, Amanda, no.
And it would mean there weren't there. So right now, the first species to come back to Chicago in any numbers is yellow-rumped warbler, and I had 10 to 12 today at Perkins Woods in Evanston. That was the first day I've had that many. So coming back to what we were talking about with respect to breeding grounds and wintering grounds, so they breed up in central Canada, but they winter actually down in the southern part of the U.S. in Louisiana and Florida and Texas. And so they're the northernmost wintering migratory warbler. And so they're the first to come back. And they'll be, there are a few other species that are starting to show up right now, like Louisiana water thrush and pine warbler in small numbers. But they're first, and then there'll be this gradual increase. And then blackpolls tend to be the later arriving things. And this is one of these things with climate change that people are really wondering about what climate change means with respect to these long distance migrant birds being able to track the conditions that they're coming back to. I mean, they've clearly evolved to get back to their breeding grounds and take advantage of a flush of insects that should be available to feed their young during the summer. And what climate change is going to do to all that is, there are predictions, but how that affects these birds is going to be something that we just need to continue to monitor.
Yeah, we don't know how resilient they are or how much lag time can be tolerated between a new habitat climate experience and their ability to change their behavior, or the cues that they use to migrate. And if it changes in both ways, it means the insects and other things they want to eat on the wintering ground to get up enough energy to make that long migration might not be there. So maybe Blackpoll warblers will have to stop a whole bunch of times along the way. And then what does that do to what time they get back there on the breeding season? Because if the insects are coming out earlier, then they're going to have to leave the wintering grounds earlier and earlier and earlier.
Oh.
So how does it balance itself out? We don't know yet.
But at the same time, I point out that back in the height of the glaciations, basically the entire breeding range of Blackpoll Warbler had to have been pushed south of places like Chicago. So there's they've seen a lot of change over their evolutionary existence, and so those are interesting questions.
Well, I think we're close on time. You guys good calling it on this one, or is there anything else about Blackpoll Warblers we want to talk about?
Well, just my primary message to folks is it's worth spending some time to get to know some of these warblers, especially in the Chicago area, because it's just a ton of fun to think that millions of these birds are coming back through in the spring, and they'll go up to these areas, breed, and then turn around and come back in the fall. And it's definitely a challenge for beginning birders, and at the same time, it's a challenge worth spending some time with because they're really cool.
I'd say this is a good time to go find a group of bird watchers and join them. So you improve your social life and you're with a group of people who can help you, especially with varying levels of expertise in that can really jumpstart what can be an incredibly frustrating experience. If you really have to know what it is, it's super, super, super frustrating.
Can't
so
imagine.
Go find some people and have fun.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's awesome.
All right. And we've got a mailbag question. So this is from Ariana from Logan Square again. So she wrote us a couple questions. So we're going to answer another one. She said, would love to hear an episode on whippoorwills or other nightjars, or on, and I'm going to have to ask John to pronounce this again.
Pyrrholoxia.
Pyrrholoxia.
Yeah.
She said, a friend of mine moved to Tucson in October and gets a ton of these desert cardinals at her feeder, and I think they're just gorgeous.
Oh,
They
Me too.
definitely
They're
are.
pink. They're pink.
wow.
Not that many pink
Yeah.
birds. They're excellent.
That's awesome. Do they look like a northern cardinal or?
They definitely do.
Wow.
Yeah. And there are northern cardinals in Tucson too. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. So they tend to be in drier habitat. And so, but they're basically a desert version of a cardinal, and
cool.
with a great name.
Yeah. That is a crazy name. Yeah.
It's a hard to pronounce name.
Between Pyrrholoxia and Phainopepla is the other one, which is an even bizarrer bird from the Southwest. But I grew up looking at Pyrrholoxias and cardinals and together in these various areas where they come into contact, but they're completely related, and they have these big seed-eating bills, and they're just like our cardinals in terms of the aspects of their behavior for the most part.
John's going to be getting in a car and driving to Tucson
To look
we
for the
talk about too many
Pyrrholoxia.
more
I hear
Tucson
you.
birds.
I didn't realize that they're pink. That's pretty
I know.
cool.
I want to see one.
Well, you have to look
Yeah,
them
I
up.
would
They're
look at-
really, really,
Yeah.
really pretty. Anybody that's a definite bonus to your yard if you have a Pyrrholoxia there frequently.
Are they just kind of in the Arizona area, or?
So they're southwestern desert. And
Okay.
so that's an interesting thing, because cardinals, the speciation there probably involved cardinals evolving in wetter areas like the east, but cardinals have expanded across the southwestern part of North America. It's to where they occur in riparian areas throughout Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. But the Pyrrholoxias are in the drier habitats in those same areas.
Very cool.
Cool. It'd be fun to do a Pyrrholoxia
we
episode
can
and
do
talk
that.
more about them.
That sounds awesome. Yeah.
We just have to get to learn to say it.
Yeah.
I think I'm mispronouncing it.
No, you're doing fine.
Okay.
learn to spell it, because that's one of those ones that's really
That's
hard
the-
to actually
Yeah.
look up, because you're thinking, now how many R's,
Right.
H's, where's the Y, where's an
Yeah.
X, what is this thing?
Yeah. Seriously.
I just think it's so funny because it's such a different. Why did that common name stick as opposed to something like desert cardinal? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. That might be knowable. That's what Google's
Well, we can
for.
discuss it on we can research for our Parallaxia episode. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for joining us. Make sure to check out our Instagram or TikTok for pictures of the birds that we discuss. If you have a question, please reach out to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. All right, see you all next week. Love you all. Thanks everyone.